The moment Staff Sergeant Ingrid Thorson spotted the old man near the cenotaph, she knew he was going to be a problem. He was standing just inside the rope line at the Vimy Ridge Memorial Pavilion in Ottawa, hands in the pockets of a worn Carhartt jacket that had faded from brown to something closer to the color of old tobacco. His boots were steel-toed Kodiaks, the leather cracked along the flex points, with dried mud caked into the treads. He looked like he had driven in from a farm somewhere along the Ottawa Valley and forgotten to change. Or maybe he hadn't forgotten. Maybe he simply didn't care. Thorson adjusted the lanyard around her neck and crossed the wet grass. She was the logistics coordinator for the National Canine Service Recognition Ceremony, a first-of-its-kind event that had taken the Department of National Defense the better part of 2 years to organize. The Governor-General was attending. 3 members of Parliament had confirmed. CBC had a camera crew setting up near the reflecting pool. Everything had to be perfect, and perfection did not include a muddy old farmer standing where the deputy minister's reserved chair was supposed to go. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her breath making small clouds in the November air. "This section is restricted to invited and active personnel. The public viewing area is just past the flagpoles." The old man turned his head. He moved slowly, not with the stiffness of age exactly, but with a kind of deliberateness, as though every motion was a considered decision. His face was deeply lined, weathered to a shade of reddish-brown that spoke of decades outdoors, and his eyes were a pale, startling gray. They settled on her without hurry. "I'm aware," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, with a faint roughness to it, like gravel shifting under running water. There was no accent she could place, or rather it was the kind of accent that had been everywhere and come from nowhere, the careful neutrality of a man who had learned to blend in wherever he went. "Then I'll need to ask you to move to the public area," Thorson said, offering her best professional smile. "We're about to begin the security sweep." He looked at her for a moment longer, and something in those gray eyes made her feel, absurdly, like she was the one being assessed. Then he nodded, a single slow inclination of his head, and took 2 steps back. Not behind the rope, not to the public area, just 2 steps, placing himself beside the thick trunk of a red maple whose leaves had mostly fallen, a carpet of crimson and gold around his mud-caked boots. It was technically compliance. It was also, Thorson realized with a flicker of irritation, technically not. She didn't have time for this. The sound technician was having trouble with the podium microphone, and the catering tent had been set up facing the wrong direction, blocking the camera crew's sightline to the cenotaph. She gave the old man a last look, decided he was harmless, and hurried away. She would think about that decision for years. 30 meters away, Corporal Jamie Flett knelt beside his partner, a Belgian Malinois named Brix, and ran a practiced hand along the dog's flank. Brix was vibrating with the controlled energy that was his default state, ears rotating like satellite dishes, cataloging every sound in the park. He was 3 years old, in peak condition, and one of the top explosive detection dogs in the Canadian Armed Forces. Flett had been paired with him since Brix was 14 months old, and in that time, the dog had become less a tool and more an extension of his own nervous system. Flett had noticed the old man before Thorson had. It was his job to notice things, and there was something about this particular civilian that had snagged his attention like a fishhook. It wasn't the clothes. Plenty of older guys showed up to military events dressed like they had just come from the hardware store. It was the way the man stood. Flett's grandfather had been a lobster fisherman in Souris, PEI. By 70, the man couldn't straighten his back fully, the result of 40 years hauling traps in the Northumberland Strait. Most old men carried their history in their posture, bent and compressed by gravity and time. This man carried nothing. He stood with his weight centered, shoulders level, his spine in the kind of alignment that Flett associated with people who had spent years being trained how to move, how to fall, how to disappear. It was the posture of someone who had been taught that stillness itself could be a weapon. Flett also noticed the man's hands. They were large and scarred, the knuckles thickened, the skin across the backs mapped with a network of pale lines that could have come from barbed wire, or broken glass, or any number of things that Flett, at 26, preferred not to imagine. But there was something else. Along the outer edge of both palms, a specific pattern of calluses, dense, ridged, built up over years. Flett had seen that exact pattern only once before, on the hands of Master Warrant Officer Pulio, a legendary K-9 trainer at CFB Edmonton, who had spent 3 decades working with the most volatile dogs in the program. It was the mark of a man who had spent a lifetime handling heavy-gauge leashes under extreme tension, the kind of tension generated by a 90-pound Malinois hitting the end of a tracking lead at full sprint. Bricks whined, a single, barely audible sound. His gaze had drifted toward the old man under the maple tree and locked there. "Easy," Flett murmured, placing a steadying hand on the dog's head. But he felt it too. Something was off. Something was pulling. The ceremony opened the way these things always did. The national anthem, performed by a military band that had driven down from Petawawa in the pre-dawn dark. A succession of speeches from officials who spoke about courage and sacrifice, and the bond between handler and dog, with the polished fluency of people reading from prepared remarks. They used words like asset and capability and operational advantage. They talked about the dogs the way you might talk about a piece of well-maintained equipment. Flett stood in formation with 5 other handlers and their canine partners, listening with half his attention. The rest was on the old man. The farmer, or whatever he was, hadn't moved from his spot beside the maple. He stood with his hands clasped loosely in front of him, watching the speakers without expression. But when one of the MPs mentioned a dog named Griff, killed by an IED in Kandahar province in 2010, the old man's jaw tightened. His eyes closed for perhaps 2 seconds. When they opened, they were wet. It was such a small thing. No one else would have seen it. But Flett saw it, and it changed everything he thought he knew about the man under the tree. The keynote speaker was Brigadier General Louise Harwood, a logistics officer who had overseen supply chains during the Afghan deployment. She was articulate and sincere, but she had never worked alongside a K9 team, and her speech, while respectful, lacked the weight that comes from experience. She spoke about the dogs with admiration but not intimacy. She described the handler-K9 bond as if it were a chemical formula, precise, reproducible, documented. Flett felt the familiar ache of frustration. People saw the ceremony, the medals, the folded flags. They didn't see the 2 a.m. training sessions in -30 weather, the weeks of patient repetition it took to build trust with an animal that had been bred for suspicion, the way your heart stopped every time your dog rounded a corner ahead of you and you couldn't see what was waiting. They didn't see the hollow, gutted feeling of holding your partner's head in your lap while the vet prepared the needle, telling him he was a good boy, the best boy, even though your voice was breaking and you knew he could hear it. General Harwood concluded to polite applause. Thorson approached the microphone, her clipboard held against her chest like a shield. "We now come to the ceremonial tribute," she announced. 6 active-duty K9 teams from the Canadian Forces Military Police will advance to the cenotaph to lay wreaths in honor of the working dogs who gave their lives in service to Canada. This was the centerpiece, the emotional climax she had spent weeks choreographing. The handlers, in unison, would march to the cenotaph. The dogs would sit, the wreaths would be placed. A bugler would play the last post. It would be solemn, beautiful, and photogenic. She had rehearsed it twice that morning. Flett and the other handlers executed a crisp turn and began the slow walk toward the cenotaph. 6 handlers, 6 dogs, boots crunching softly on the gravel path. Bricks moved at Flett's left heel, his gait measured and precise, every muscle coiled but controlled. To Flett's right was a German shepherd named Sable, partnered with Corporal Dominique Laforge. Behind them, a black Labrador called Fender, a Dutch shepherd named Kestrel, and 2 more Malinois, Phantom and Zara. The crowd had gone quiet. Phones were raised. The only sounds were boots, breathing, and the faint clink of dog tags. They were 15 meters from the cenotaph when it began. Sable broke first. The German shepherd, an 8-year veteran with a discipline record that was virtually flawless, stopped dead in the middle of the procession. She lowered her head, her nose working frantically, and let out a high, keening whine that cut through the silence like a blade. Laforge gave a short correction on the leash. Sable heel, nothing. The dog didn't even seem to hear her. Then Kestrel. The Dutch shepherd began to pull to the left, straining against her collar, her tail wagging in short, frantic bursts. She wasn't aggressive, wasn't frightened. She was searching. Brick started shaking. Not a tremble of cold or fear, but a full-body vibration, as though every nerve in his body had been connected to a live wire. He whined, a deep sound that seemed to come from somewhere in his chest, and his head swung toward the maple tree, toward the old man. Within seconds, all 6 dogs had broken formation. Phantom was pulling so hard his handler had to dig her heels into the gravel to keep from being dragged. Fender, the Labrador, was straining at the end of his lead, his bark high and pleading. Zara was spinning in tight circles, her eyes fixed on a single point. The old man under the tree, the procession disintegrated. 6 highly trained military dogs, the best in the country, were ignoring their handlers completely. The crowd erupted in confused murmurs. Camera operators looked at each other, unsure whether to keep filming. General Harwood rose to her feet on the stage, her expression tight with concern. Thorson felt the blood drain from her face. Her ceremony, her 2 years of planning, was collapsing in real time on national television. Her eyes swept the scene, searching for a cause, and landed on the old man. He was the variable, the anomaly. He must have done something. A whistle, a command, something. She started across the grass, her jaw set, her heels sinking into the soft ground. "Sir, you need to leave immediately. You are disrupting an official military ceremony, and I will have security remove you if, ma'am." Corporal Flett was at her elbow. He hadn't tried to restrain Bricks. The leash hung loose in his hand, and his face was pale, his eyes wide, fixed on the old man with an expression that Thorson couldn't read. Shock, maybe, or something closer to reverence. "What?" she snapped. "Don't," Flett said quietly. "Please, just look at them." "Look at what?" "He's ruining everything. He hasn't done anything." Flett's voice was barely above a whisper. "They're not panicking. They're not aggressive. Listen to them. Watch how they're moving." Thorson stopped. She actually looked, at the 6 dogs. They weren't barking hysterically. They weren't cowering. They were pulling with intent, with focus, with a kind of desperate, yearning purpose. Their tails were wagging. Their bodies were leaning forward. It was, she realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the November air, the posture of dogs reporting to a handler. But the old man wasn't their handler. He was nobody, except the dogs seemed to think otherwise. On the stage, a man in civilian clothes stood up from the second row of chairs. He was in his 70s, lean and sharp-featured, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested a lifetime in uniform even though he wasn't wearing one. His name was Brigadier General, retired, Ross Pennington, and he had been invited as a courtesy, a former commander of the Canadian Forces K9 Training Center in Rolleston, Alberta. He had said nothing during the ceremony, had sat quietly through the speeches, his hands folded in his lap. Now he was moving. He walked past Thorson without a glance, past the scrambling handlers, past the confused dignitaries, and crossed the grass in long, unhurried strides. He stopped 2 meters from the old man and stood there, looking at him the way an archaeologist might look at an artifact he had believed was lost forever. The old man met his gaze, those pale gray eyes steady as stone. "My God," Pennington said. His voice was hoarse. "It's you, Owen Rathburn." The old man's expression didn't change. "Hello, Ross. We put you on the memorial list, the unofficial one. Presumed dead." A slight, sad curve at the corner of the old man's mouth. That was the idea. Pennington shook his head slowly, as though trying to clear a dream. Then he turned to face the crowd. When he spoke, his voice carried the parade ground authority of a man who had commanded thousands, and it cut through the murmuring like a rifle shot. "Handlers, stand down. Release your dogs." Corporal LaForge looked at the general, then at her superior officer, then back at the general. "Sir, with respect, the Governor General is. I said release them." Pennington's tone left no room for debate. "That's not a suggestion." 6 leashes were unclipped. 6 dogs, freed, did not scatter. They moved together, flowing across the grass in a loose formation, past the wreaths, past the cenotaph, past everything that was supposed to matter today, and straight to the old man under the red maple. They did not jump. They did not bark. One by one, they lay down at his feet. The big German shepherd pressed her flank against his boot. The Labrador rested his chin on the man's knee. Bricks, trembling, pushed his head under the old man's scarred hand and went still. The crowd was silent. Thorson had stopped moving. Her clipboard hung at her side, forgotten. Owen Rathburn looked down at the 6 dogs surrounding him, and for the first time since he had arrived at the memorial, his composure broke. His jaw clenched, his eyes filled. A single tear ran down the deep creases of his weathered face and disappeared into the collar of his jacket. He lowered himself to one knee, slowly, his joints protesting, and laid both hands on the dogs nearest him. "Hello," he said, his voice thick and rough. "I know your bloodlines, all of you. I knew your grandmothers. I knew your great-grandfathers. They were the bravest souls I've ever met." Pennington turned back to the stunned audience. He stood straight, shoulders back, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. "Ladies and gentlemen, You've spent the last hour hearing speeches about the legacy of Canada's military working dog program. You've heard about courage and sacrifice and the bond between handler and canine. Those were fine words, but the man kneeling behind me lived them, every single one. He paused, letting the silence settle. His name is Owen Rathburn, Master Warrant Officer, retired, and if that name means nothing to you, it should, because every dog sitting at his feet right now exists because of him. Every training protocol in the Canadian Canine Program, every scent detection methodology, every field deployment doctrine. Owen Rathburn wrote them. Not a committee, not a research group. Him. Pennington's voice hardened. In 1973, when the K9 program was 6 months from being shut down because a report from Ottawa called it, and I'm quoting from memory, an unjustifiable expenditure with limited operational return, one man kept it alive. He went to Cyprus. He went to the Golan Heights. He went to places that are still classified. He took dogs that the brass had written off as untrainable and he turned them into the most effective detection teams in NATO. He didn't do it with force. He didn't do it with shortcuts. He did it by understanding that a dog isn't a tool. A dog is a partner, and a partner deserves respect, patience, and trust. He pointed at the dogs lying at Rathburn's feet. These 6 dogs represent 4 of the primary bloodlines that Owen Rathburn personally established for the Canadian program. The Shepherds, the Malinois, the Labradors. He selected their ancestors. He shaped their breeding lines for temperament, for courage, for the specific kind of intelligence that lets a dog read a human being's intent before the human being knows it themselves. These dogs have never seen this man. They were born years after he disappeared. But they know him. It's in their blood. It's in their bones. Call it instinct. Call it genetic memory. Call it whatever you want. I call it legacy. The Governor General, who had been sitting in the front row with an expression of measured composure, quietly reached up and removed her glasses. She pressed a folded handkerchief to her eyes. In the 3rd row, a young corporal from CFB Borden was openly weeping. Thorson stood frozen, her mind struggling to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she thought she knew about the man she had tried to escort off the grounds an hour ago. She had looked at his muddy boots and his faded jacket and seen an inconvenience. She had filed him under problem to manage. She had measured him against her seating chart and found him lacking. She had been looking at a legend and had seen a trespasser. The shame hit her like a physical force, hot and suffocating. She thought about how she had smiled at him, that thin, professional smile that wasn't really a smile at all but a wall, a way of saying, "You don't belong here," without using the words. She thought about the generals and politicians she had fawned over all morning, people who had read their speeches from teleprompters and would forget the names on the cenotaph before their cars reached the Queensway. And she thought about this man who had driven God knows how far, in God knows what kind of truck, to stand in the November cold and pay his respects to animals whose existence he had made possible, and who had asked for nothing in return. Not a chair, not a program listing, not even to be seen. She walked forward. Her heels had sunk into the grass, and she pulled them free with small sucking sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. She stopped beside Pennington, and for a long moment she couldn't speak. "Master Warrant Officer," she said at last, and her voice wavered badly. "I owe you an apology." Rathburn looked up from the dogs. His gray eyes found hers, and they held no anger, no satisfaction, no judgment. They held the quiet, patient understanding of a man who had spent his life being underestimated, and had long ago stopped taking it personally. "You were doing your job," he said simply. "The ceremony matters. Remembering them matters. That's why I came." He looked past her, at the cenotaph where the names of fallen K9s were engraved in the black granite. His gaze lingered on one name near the top. "Whiskey," he said softly, almost to himself. "Dutch Shepherd. She found 11 IEDs in Kandahar before the 12th one found her. I bred her grandmother, trained her mother." He paused. "Her mother used to steal my gloves every single morning. Couldn't break her of it. Didn't want to." The Labrador at his feet shifted, pressing closer against his leg, and Rathburn absently ran his hand along the dog's back. He turned to Corporal Flett, who was standing a few meters away, rigid, his eyes red. "Your dog. What's his name?" "Bricks, Master Warrant Officer. Designation MWD 2247. Rathburn studied the Malinois for a moment. Then a faint smile crossed his face, the first genuine one Thorson had seen from him. "He's from Victor's line. I can see it. The head shape, the way he holds his ears. Victor was the most stubborn animal I've ever worked with. Took me 4 months to earn his trust. But once I had it, he stopped, cleared his throat. Once I had it, there was nothing on this earth that dog wouldn't do for me. He reached out not to the dog, but to Flet. He took the young corporal's hand. His grip was dry and immensely strong, the calluses rough against Flet's skin. "You've got good instincts," Rathburn said, looking him in the eye. "He trusts you. That's the only thing that matters. Everything else, the certifications, the deployment ratings, the evaluations, it's all noise. Trust is the whole program. You lose that, you lose everything." "Sir," Flet managed, his voice cracking, "your field notes, the ones from the 70s, they still circulate at the training center, unofficial copies. We call them the Rathburn Protocols. They never told us who wrote them. The cover pages just say DND internal, author classified." Rathburn released his hand. "Names aren't important," he said. "The dogs are. The people who work with them are. That's what lasts." He knelt again, this time with less difficulty, as though the dog's presence had eased something in his body. He began to speak to them, his voice too low for anyone else to hear clearly. Those close enough caught fragments. He was pointing at the cenotaph, then murmuring to the German shepherd, running a hand along the Labrador's spine. He was telling them stories. He was introducing them to the dogs whose names were carved in the stone. He was connecting the living to the dead, the present to the past, with nothing more than his voice and his hands. The handlers drifted forward, one by one, forming a loose semicircle. Not guarding, watching, learning. They were in the presence of the source, the headwater from which their entire profession had flowed, and they knew it with the bone-deep certainty that training breeds into a person. The Governor-General had risen from her seat. She did not approach, did not intrude. She stood at the edge of the stage, her hands clasped in front of her, watching an old man in a Carhartt jacket command more authority and devotion than anyone who had spoken from her podium. The MPs were still. The cameras were rolling, but somehow, the moment felt private, as though a circle had been drawn around the maple tree and the world outside it had agreed to wait. 10 minutes passed, maybe 15. Time had become irrelevant. Finally, Rathburn stood. He touched each dog one last time, a firm press of his palm on each head, a gesture that carried the solemnity of a benediction. "All right," he said, his voice steady again, restored to that low gravel-bed calm. "Go back to your handlers. They need you. You've got work to do." The dogs seemed to shake themselves, as though waking from a deep sleep. They looked at Rathburn, then at their handlers. One by one, they trotted back, each finding their partner with unerring precision, pressing against legs, nudging hands, resuming the bond that was their purpose. Brix reached Flet and pushed his head into the corporal's thigh, and Flet dropped to one knee and wrapped his arms around the dog's neck and held on. When he looked up, Owen Rathburn was gone. He hadn't said goodbye, hadn't waited for the Governor-General to offer a handshake or a commendation, hadn't given Thorson his phone number or his address. He had simply turned and walked away, moving through the bare trees with the same unhurried, deliberate gait that had first drawn Flet's attention, until the November mist and the red maple leaves swallowed him whole. What remained was a set of muddy boot prints on the manicured grass, a circle of flattened earth where 6 dogs had lain, and a silence that felt, to everyone who stood in it, like something sacred. Pennington walked to the cenotaph. He reached out and touched one of the names etched into the stone. Victor. He let his fingers rest there for a moment, then looked at Flet, who was still kneeling with his arms around Brix. "You know, Corporal," Pennington said, his voice quiet, carrying the weight of a man who had watched an entire era walk away through the trees. "Legions never really disappear. They just stop needing anyone to see them. The work goes on, the bloodlines go on, the trust goes on." He looked toward the tree line where Rathburn had vanished, and the faintest smile crossed his weathered face. "That's the whole point. That's always been the whole point." The crowd dispersed slowly, not with the polite chatter of a concluded event, but with the hushed, reflective quiet of people who had come to see a monument of granite and steel, and had instead been shown a monument of flesh and blood and silence. A man in muddy boots who had built a legacy so deep it lived in the bones of animals, who had never known his name, and who had wanted nothing from the world but to stand among them one last time and remember.